Platforms the size of skyscrapers anchored in the Mediterranean, tunnels that were supposed to slice through 180 kilometers of desert, rail lines designed to revolutionize how an entire nation moves. Israel's betting billions on infrastructure that could reshape the Middle East, but here's what nobody's talking about. Every pipeline is a potential target. Every mega project comes with a price tag that keeps climbing. And some of these ambitious plans have already collapsed before a single shovel hit the ground. This isn't just about building roads and pumping gas, it's about survival, power, and money on a scale that would make your head spin. The real story starts beneath the waves, where engineers pulled off something that seemed impossible just a decade ago. 10 kilometers off Israel's coastline, a structure rises from the Mediterranean that rivals two Empire State Buildings stacked end to end. The Leviathan gas platform sits above one of the largest natural gas discoveries of the 21st century, a reservoir holding over 600 billion cubic meters of recoverable gas. Getting to this point required 200 engineers and thousands of workers from 25 different countries, all coordinating to drill wells that reach 1,500 meters below the seabed. 4 massive wells tap into pressure and heat that took millions of years to create, and now twin 18-inch pipelines stretch 117 kilometers across the seafloor, carrying raw gas to processing facilities that run every single hour of every single day. The Tamar field, discovered a year earlier, adds another 8 billion cubic meters annually to the mix. Together, these two operations transformed Israel from a nation that imported almost all its energy into a major regional supplier practically overnight. By 2019, production hit 25 billion cubic meters per year, enough to power the entire country and still have plenty left over to sell. But here's where things get interesting. In August 2025, Israel signed a deal with Egypt worth $35 billion, the largest agreement in the nation's history. The money flowing through these pipelines isn't just keeping lights on anymore. It's funding government budgets, cementing diplomatic relationships, and creating leverage that didn't exist 5 years ago. New expansion plans approved in 2024 aim to push Leviathan's capacity to 21 billion cubic meters annually, backed by a $2.4 billion investment. Every cubic meter that leaves those platforms generates revenue, but it also creates risk. And in June 2025, that risk became terrifyingly real. Alarms screamed across the Leviathan platform as operators received urgent security warnings. Iranian missile strikes had just hit the Haifa refinery complex, and 3 workers were dead. The entire facility went into emergency shutdown mode, cutting off gas flows that power cities across the region. For the first time, the vulnerability of Israel's energy revolution was exposed in the harshest way possible. These platforms, visible from satellites and anchored in predictable locations, became sitting targets the moment tensions escalated. The Leviathan shutdown lasted days, not hours, and every minute offline meant millions in lost revenue and broken supply contracts. Reports from industry insiders suggest the platforms lack the defensive systems needed to operate safely during conflict, yet they sit in waters that have seen repeated military activity over the past year alone. Security analysts have quietly pointed out what should have been obvious from the start. Concentrating so much critical infrastructure in exposed offshore locations creates a single point of failure that any adversary can exploit. The June attacks proved this wasn't theoretical anymore. Energy independence suddenly looked a lot like energy exposure, and the billions invested in drilling and pipelines could evaporate the moment another missile gets through. Insurance premiums for offshore operations in the eastern Mediterranean have reportedly spiked, and some international partners are said to be reconsidering long-term commitments. While the platforms kept producing after the shutdown, the incident left a mark that no amount of engineering can erase. Billions in infrastructure can be built, but protecting it during the chaos that defines this region is an entirely different challenge. While gas fields burned and platforms went dark, another mega project was quietly falling apart. The Red Sea to Dead Sea Canal, once hailed as an engineering marvel that would save the lowest point on Earth, never made it past the planning stage. The original vision was breathtaking in scope. A 180-kilometer pipeline would pump 200 million cubic meters of seawater annually from the Gulf of Aqaba to the Dead Sea, using the elevation drop to generate 150 megawatts of hydroelectric power along the way. The plan promised fresh water for Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories, while stabilizing a lake that loses more than a meter of depth every single year. Engineers from 3 countries spent years running simulations, drilling test bores, and mapping routes through some of the harshest terrain on the planet. But by June 2021, the project was officially abandoned. Jordan pulled the plug, with officials citing no real Israeli desire to move forward. Behind that diplomatic language sat a mountain of problems nobody wanted to admit publicly. The budget had ballooned from $3 billion to nearly $5 billion as cost overruns piled up. Tunneling delays, legal battles over land seizures, and forced reroutes around protected habitats added $500 million in unexpected expenses. Bedouin communities and kibbutzim filed lawsuits that forced an 11-kilometer realignment, and environmental groups won injunctions that brought work to a standstill. International donors started backing away after warnings that mixing Red Sea and Dead Sea waters could trigger unpredictable chemical reactions and destroy rare ecosystems that exist nowhere else on Earth. Marine biologists warned about salinity plumes, groundwater contamination, and long-term damage that wouldn't show up for decades but would be irreversible once it did. Then in May 2024, a new proposal emerged. Forget the Red Sea connection. Instead, pump water from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea, a shorter route with different engineering challenges but the same fundamental problems. Planners claim this version could be operational by 2045, more than 2 decades from now. But that timeline assumes smooth approvals, stable funding, and zero political complications. Given what happened to the original canal, betting on any of those assumptions seems wildly optimistic. The Dead Sea keeps shrinking while committees meet and budgets get revised, and the gap between what was promised and what's actually being delivered grows wider every year. Some engineers who worked on the first plan have privately expressed doubts that any canal will ever get built, regardless of the route chosen. The technical challenges are real, but the political and financial obstacles might be insurmountable. Meanwhile, the Dead Sea loses another meter of depth. Sinkholes keep opening up along the shoreline, and the clock keeps ticking on a crisis that mega projects were supposed to solve. At least the high-speed rail network was moving forward, or so the headlines claimed. The reality on the ground tells a messier story. Israel launched its Connecting Israel initiative in July 2023, a 300-kilometer network designed to link every major city with trains hitting speeds most countries can only dream about. The Tel Aviv to Haifa line broke ground in December 2024, with promises that passengers would be traveling at 250 kilometers per hour by 2029. The cabinet approved an even more ambitious Kiryat Shmona to Eilat line, stretching the network from the northern border all the way to the Red Sea. But insiders are already questioning whether passenger traffic will ever justify the massive costs. The Tel Aviv to Jerusalem line serves as a cautionary tale that nobody wants to talk about. That route took 2 full decades to complete, with costs exploding from $2.8 billion to nearly $7 billion by the time trains finally started running. The same pattern is repeating itself across the new network. Over 110 land parcels have been seized under eminent domain, triggering lawsuits from Bedouin families and agricultural communities who suddenly found themselves in the path of progress. Environmental groups won an injunction that forced a costly reroute near the Sharon region, adding $220 million to the budget and nearly a year of delays. The Ministry of Justice offered higher compensation and relocation packages, but the legal battles continue as of late 2025 with no clear end in sight. Earthworks are reportedly 70% complete on some sections, but that number hides the real challenges ahead. Laying track, installing signaling systems, electrifying the entire network, and building stations capable of handling the promised passenger volumes will dwarf what's been spent so far. The public-private partnership funding the project splits costs 70-30 between debt and equity, with Israeli banks and European lenders syndicating billions in loans. The consortium behind the construction holds a 25-year contract, 6 years to build and 19 to run and maintain. But every delay and every lawsuit pushes that timeline further out, and every budget overrun makes investors more nervous. Some financial analysts have quietly suggested that if current trends continue, the rail network might not reach full operational capacity until the mid-2030s, nearly a decade later than promised. The vision of shifting 40% of intercity traffic from highways to rail sounds great in press releases, but delivering that reality requires finishing construction, winning the legal fights, and convincing people to actually use trains instead of cars. None of those outcomes are guaranteed, and the gap between ambition and execution keeps getting harder to ignore. While rail projects faced delays and canals died on the drawing board, billions were flowing into a different kind of transformation. Ashdod's petrochemical cluster became the showpiece of Israel's industrial ambitions, a $4 billion network of plants churning out 1 million tons of polyolefins every year. These aren't luxury goods. They're the raw materials for medical tubing, car parts, packaging, and thousands of products that modern life depends on. What made Ashdod special was the direct pipeline connection to the Leviathan and Tamar gas fields. Cheap, abundant natural gas flowing straight into processing plants gave Israeli-made polymers a cost advantage that let them compete with European and Gulf suppliers who had dominated the market for decades. Annual exports were forecast to hit $2 billion, with shipments heading to Asia, Africa, and the EU. The cluster created 10,000 skilled jobs, pulling engineers and process managers from Tel Aviv's tech sector into a world of round-the-clock refining, logistics tracking, and chemical production that never stops. For many workers, it represented a leap from digital screens to industrial frontiers, proof that Israel's economic future didn't have to run solely on code and defense contracts. But the numbers from 2024 started telling a different story. Refinery outputs hit their lowest levels since the pandemic years, with ongoing maintenance issues forcing partial shutdowns and delayed shipments. Industry reports suggest some facilities are struggling with equipment that's being pushed harder than it was designed to handle, and replacement parts aren't always arriving on schedule. More concerning is the geographic concentration. Most of Israel's petrochemical capacity sits in one location, creating the same single-point vulnerability that plagues the offshore gas platforms. A successful strike on Ashdod's chemical plants would cripple exports, eliminate thousands of jobs, and cut off revenue streams that the government has started to rely on. Insurance costs have reportedly climbed as security analysts flag the risk, and some international buyers are said to be exploring alternative suppliers just in case. The cluster's success depends entirely on cheap gas from fields that we already know can be shut down during conflict, and on facilities that sit exposed on the coastline. Long-term viability looks a lot shakier when you factor in geopolitical realities that aren't going away. The billions invested might generate impressive returns during peacetime, but peacetime in this region has never been something anyone can count on. All these projects, the platforms, the failed canals, the delayed trains, the chemical plants, they're tied together by a single narrative that sounds great in diplomatic meetings. Gas exports brought in $3 billion in 2024, a 13% increase despite the war in Gaza. Royalties hit a record $694 million, money that flows directly into government coffers and funds everything from infrastructure to social programs. In September 2025, Israel signed a $610 million deal to build the Nitzana pipeline, boosting export capacity to Egypt even further. The Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum keeps meeting, with delegates from Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and Cyprus sitting down to hash out supply agreements and manage the tensions that bubble up constantly. On paper, it looks like energy diplomacy is working, turning resources into relationships and creating economic ties that give everyone a reason to keep things stable. But scratch beneath the surface, and the picture gets murkier. Marine biologists continue warning about seabed damage from offshore drilling. Studies have documented underwater noise pollution and chemical leaks from the platforms, raising alarms about long-term impacts on fish populations and plankton that form the base of the entire marine food chain. The UN is still mediating maritime boundary disputes with Lebanon, where a 2022 agreement allowed Lebanon to develop the Karish prospect but left both nations eyeing each other's territorial claims. Every new contract and every new pipeline brings economic benefits, but also environmental costs and political complications that don't have easy solutions. Reports suggest some partner nations are quietly exploring alternative energy sources, hedging their bets in case Israeli gas becomes unreliable or politically toxic. The dependence runs both ways now. Israel needs the export revenue, and neighboring countries need the gas. But that interdependence only works as long as pipelines keep flowing and platforms keep producing. One major disruption, whether from conflict, accident, or political decision, could unravel agreements that took years to negotiate. Energy independence was supposed to bring security and stability. Instead, it created a web of obligations, vulnerabilities, and competing interests that's just as complicated as what existed before. The difference is now, there are billions of dollars in critical infrastructure sitting in harm's way, and the stakes for getting things wrong have never been higher. So where does all this leave Israel as we head deeper into 2025? The gas platforms are producing 25 billion cubic meters annually. That part is real and measurable. The Two Seas Canal is officially dead, replaced by a Mediterranean proposal that won't be operational for decades, if it ever gets built at all. The high-speed rail network is 70% through earthworks, but mired in legal battles, budget overruns, and timelines that keep sliding to the right. Ashdod's petrochemical cluster created over 30,000 jobs across related industries and generates billions in exports, but faces maintenance issues and geographic vulnerability that industry insiders are starting to worry about publicly. Ecological concerns about offshore drilling remain unresolved. Regional disputes over maritime boundaries continue, and the platforms that produce all this wealth can be shut down by a missile strike, as we saw in June. The vision of transformation from energy importer to regional powerhouse has absolutely been realized in some ways. Israel generates more gas than it needs, exports power the economies of neighboring nations, and the revenue funds national priorities that wouldn't be possible otherwise. But here's what the glossy presentations and government announcements don't emphasize. Those billion-dollar platforms are visible targets anchored in predictable locations. Mega canals remain pipe dreams, stuck in political quicksand and environmental reviews that never quite get resolved. Rail networks are running decades behind schedule and billions over budget, with legal fights that could drag on for years. And the environmental impact of all this drilling, pumping, and building won't be fully understood for generations. The ultimate success of these projects depends on factors that remain completely out of anyone's control. Geopolitical stability in a region that's never been stable, environmental outcomes that are still being studied, legal battles that are far from settled, and economic assumptions that might not hold up if global energy markets shift or regional relationships deteriorate. Israel has absolutely built something impressive: platforms that produce massive quantities of gas, industrial clusters that export billions worth of goods, rail lines that are slowly taking shape beneath the earth. But whether these mega projects represent a lasting transformation or just expensive infrastructure that's one crisis away from becoming a liability, that question is still very much open. The evidence so far suggests transformation is real, but fragile. The risks are mounting alongside the rewards, and the long-term consequences of betting so heavily on offshore gas, delayed transit, and vulnerable industrial sites won't be clear for decades to come. What's certain is this: Israel's future is now tied to pipelines that cross seafloors, platforms that can't move, and diplomatic relationships that can change with a single political decision. The nation has built its way out of energy scarcity, but in doing so, it might have just painted targets on its back that it can't afford to defend forever.